it's only about $150 million to replace the energy like transformers that have been destroyed. But the issue is that how do you defend them? Ukraine still isn't able to defend them the way it wants to. Its patchwork of air defense is not up to Western standards.
Vladimir Putin watched Russia's nuclear exercises via video link in a room of white walls and white furniture. He's pictured alone at a giant circular table, imagine that, surrounded by screens showing military hardware. Ballistic and cruise missiles were launched from the Arctic to the far east of Russia. Let's get the latest on the situation in Ukraine with all of that context in mind. Sergio Olmos joins us, journalist in Kyiv. Sergio, good morning.
Good morning.
I suppose with what we've just described in mind and this continued aggressive sort of attitude, I suppose, from Putin, albeit scheduled military exercises, what can you gauge in terms of how Ukrainians are feeling about the status and stage of the war?
They're feeling optimistic because of the advances they're making in the east and in the south. For months, Ukrainians were defending, and in the last couple weeks, months, they've been advancing, and that's really got Ukrainians feeling buoyant. There's just been missile strike after missile strike all across the country, and so these gains really do mean a lot for Ukrainians.
I suppose one thing that I always, I'm interested in when we are talking so much about the nuclear threat, and with these latest nuclear exercises in mind, do you feel like that dominates conversation in Kyiv, or is it something that actually people are pretty relaxed about, if that's the right word?
I wouldn't say relaxed. I think they see it as a threat to make the West, to try to scare the West into stop and to ceasing, giving aid to Ukraine. Ukrainians really don't think that Russia will use nuclear weapons. They don't buy it. I mean, there is fear about it, and people do talk about like how they would deal with it, and where they would go if something were to happen and stuff like that. But like the consensus amongst like Ukrainian just everyday people is kind of that this is a way of ramping up rhetoric to try to scare the world into forcing Ukraine to the negotiating table.
One of the current, I suppose, flashpoints, focal points is in Kherson, which was a city that Russia took relatively early on in the war, but actually it is now under pressure from the Ukrainian advance. Just tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I spent some time right at the front line in Trifonivka, which is right at the edge of the Russians were fighting Ukrainian soldiers there. They were a kilometer away, like the Russians were a kilometer away. I was right there. Then I spent some time in some liberated settlements in the Kherson region, and the most striking takeaway was how different it is from the east, where I've been to Izum and Balaklia and Kupiansk and Liman, in the Kharkiv and Donetsk region, and the terrain is very different there. There's forests and stuff. In Kherson, it's steppe geography, so it's open, it's flat terrain, and you can see for kilometers in every direction. And that really struck me of how dangerous it is. I mean, there's drones overhead and aircraft and artillery, and we saw trenches, like lots of trenches, World War I style trenches. And it just struck me of how bloody this is, which is something that defense ministers been talking about, how they're taking terrain, step by step, kilometer by kilometer, and being down there, I really understood what that meant. This is every kilometer is paid for in blood down there.
Wow. In terms of other areas of concern and that deserve attention, what is the situation in the capital, Kyiv? There was one suggestion I saw early this morning that the region surrounding Kyiv may have been struck overnight.
Yeah, that's right. We, actually, all night we were getting air raid alert sirens, and you're listening now for the sound of a lawnmower because that's what the drones sound like. And I thought I heard it a few times, and it was just it wasn't, but we heard that something was struck in the region. Sometimes you hear explosions, and you'll check the telegrams, and oftentimes, these telegrams are very popular here, and people will say, they'll post up an audio clip or a picture of air defense knocking something out of the air, and that's quite common. People here will, as soon as an air raid siren hits, they'll kind of check the telegram and see what people are saying. Sometimes different governors will, especially the governor Mykolaiv will say, cruise missiles have been launched from Black Caspian Sea, 8 of them, and people will know, okay, we got about 20 minutes. I should seek shelter.
Mm. There's some interesting advice as well from Ukrainian officials, authorities, advising refugees living abroad not to return until the spring at this point because of concerns about the damages to energy infrastructure and whether energy infrastructure will handle the winter. And I suppose this just builds on this idea that kind of energy and food and resources are being kind of weaponized really by Russia. But that suggestion that refugees may not be able to return until well into the new year, I suppose gives us an idea of how much of a process is going to be involved in Ukraine attempting to get back on its feet whenever it can have a clear run at that.
Absolutely. The deputy prime minister actually said that, and she said that the power grid wouldn't be able to handle it. It would collapse. And she asked people living abroad, millions of mostly women and children living abroad, to stay there until spring. At the moment, more than 40% of Ukraine's electrical capacity has been damaged because of the drones and missile strikes. And it's so interesting because it's only about $150 million to replace the energy like transformers that have been destroyed. But the issue is that how do you defend them? Ukraine still isn't able to defend them the way it wants to. Its patchwork of air defense is not up to Western standards. And so, like, what that means for everyday people is I constantly run into guys, especially in places like Kharkiv, where it is fathers who are I'll spend days with different people and doing different things, covering the war, and they'll show me pictures of their family and they'll FaceTime their family, and they've been now 9 months without like seeing their family. So it's really difficult on families to not see them. Many of them thought they could maybe return. Air defense is getting better, and then with these drones, now to wait till spring for a lot of families, it's really difficult.
Yeah. Sergio, thanks so much. Thanks for the updates. Good to speak to you this morning. That is Sergio Olmos, who's a journalist, speaking to us live from Kyiv this morning.